Hello all and welcome back to Finominal UK for another portfolio review. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Vanguard LifeStrategy 60% equity fund slash portfolio. The reason why this one is quite interesting is what I would say is because it is a fund of funds portfolio. Now, when I say that, all it means is I can go over to the Fund Explorer and we can see it's here. But the only issue with analysing just off of using the ISIN, if I head over to the portfolio analyzer, the actual holdings data only shows the fund. Not that helpful. Now, the way I've been able to get around that within Finominal, I've created portfolio. I've labeled it Vanguard LifeStrategy 6% equity fund. So I've already done that, so I'll just edit that. But I've then gone over to the fact sheet. I've then seen the most recent holdings data as of the 30th of November 2025. And I've inputted them here, and then the Finominal platform also automatically selects the most appropriate benchmark, which does this having the highest correlation to tracking error against a universe of well-known peers, effectively. But the more interesting bit now, if we press rebalance, if we change this date to the since inception date of the portfolio, so I've done this just a day after, 24th of June 2011. If we put in the actual the fund of fund ISIN, if that makes sense, put it in here, we've then got this then turns from a static portfolio to a dynamic portfolio, and we've got data since inception as well as the most recent holdings data. So that's obviously very handy because now we've got all that data. So before we continue with this analysis, let's first take a look at the fact sheet. Now, I'm actually using Vanguard's web version of the fact sheet just because their usual fact sheet didn't have as much information that I needed to look at. Because this is a web version, wasn't able to highlight either, so a little bit irritating, but I have made some comments, so we shall this will summarize this effectively, okay? So key policy statements from Vanguard. These are not interpretations, this is what is summarized here. So they've got a predefined asset allocation of 60% equity, 40% bonds, fund of funds structure using passive underlying funds, actively managed only at the allocation and rebalancing level, UK equity home bias within the equity sleeve, so approximately 25% of equity exposure in UK listed companies, segmented fixed income, so not a single bond bucket, includes government bonds, index-linked gilts and investment grade credit. They have a sterling bias within fixed income of approximately 35% of assets in pound-denominated bonds. Ongoing charge of 0.22% with transaction costs applying within that. And inception date the 23rd of June 2011. Now, in regards for our analysis and benchmark selection for this portfolio, I'm not actually going to use a generic 60-40 benchmark, which we have done in prior videos. Now, a standard 60-40 benchmark collapses structure into outcome, whereas Vanguard explicitly separates UK versus global equity, government versus corporate bonds, sterling versus non-sterling exposure, and using a single equity ETF and a single bond ETF would remove these policy choices, effectively. Now, in regards to the initial constraints that I've made a note of, to apply for a composite benchmark, so must reflect Vanguard's policy structure, not optimised performance. It must align with data availability pre the 23rd of June 2011, and it also must preserve UK equity home bias, segmented fixed income, pound exposure, must use liquid, low-cost index funds as proxies, and keep construction interpretable, not over-engineered. Okay, so with this in mind, I have then gone over to my custom benchmarks within Finominal, and I've created benchmark, and I've labeled this the LifeStrategy 60% equity strategic composite benchmark. In regards to the holdings within this composite benchmark, so we have the iShares Core MSCI World UCITS ETF, and that's the global developed equity exposure, and that's an inception date since the 29th of September 2009. Well, we can see all of this data here, so I'll just note the actual the portfolios, the funds, should I say. We also have HSBC FTSE 100, so that's the explicit UK equity home bias. And we also have the iShares Global Government Bond, and that's the global sovereign bonds, as well as the Swiss UK Gilt Life Fund, that's the UK government bond exposure, and also the iShares Core Pounds Corporate Bond UCITS ETF, that's the investment grade sterling credit. Just to note, these 5 funds map directly to Vanguard's stated policy buckets, as we saw on the initial PDF. So that's global versus UK equity split, segmented fixed income, so government versus credit, explicit sterling exposure, fund of funds structure using low-cost index vehicles, and full data availability back to or before the 23rd of June 2011. So why not collapse this into a 2-fund 60/40 portfolio for our analysis? A 2-fund solution answers what is the simplest way to achieve a 60/40 exposure, whereas this 5-fund composite answers what policy decision, should I say, is Vanguard actually making. So both approaches are completely valid, they're just answering different questions. Okay. Now, with this in mind, let's continue with our analysis. So I'm going to head over back to my dashboard and we'll go over to the portfolio analyzer, where, as mentioned, I'm going to select my custom benchmark that we have set. And we can see initially, just looking at the performance benchmarking, the Vanguard LifeStrategy 60% equity fund / portfolio has tracked very closely with the strategic composite benchmark. So what does this mean? All this means is that they're clearly performing and delivering within their policy restraints, is what I would say. They are doing this at a fee of 0.22%, so quite cheap. Though I will note, not quite as cheap as the composite that we made of 0.17%, and they are also fully constrained to just Vanguard associated companies for the underlying holdings. And we've got a number of holdings here as well. There's 17 holdings here, so versus the 5 that we done, and also at a cheaper fee as well. So just to be noted on that. But again, we're not just looking at performance, though we will of course note it. So CAGR 7.5%, volatility 7.9%, I beg your pardon, CAGR of 7.5% and volatility of 7.9%. It has seen a slightly higher max drawdown versus the composite benchmark, as displayed here. And in regards to the tracking error, we've actually got a tracking error of 3.95%. So that's just telling us how close this portfolio is to that composite benchmark that we just made. Okay. Now we could look at some of the other things, parts here. I will go over to asset classes and markets. We'll also look at sectors after that. Okay. But as mentioned, this won't be like a standard analysis video, as I mainly want to see if they're following their policy intent. It's a 60/40 portfolio. It's pretty, it's quite standard. I would say people are quite familiar with that. So let's just see if they're working within their constraints. So just under a 50% bias to the US, just under 24% in the UK, mainly consisting of large cap, just under 80%, and we've got a sliver of emerging markets exposure as well, just under 5% there. In regards to the sectors they're invested in, let's see how they compare to the composite benchmark that we saw. Okay, so obviously main exposure is in information tech with a 18.3% exposure, and that's also a slight difference of 0.7% overweight versus our composite benchmark. And I also notice ever so slight overweight in financials as well, 0.6% versus the composite benchmark, and underweight very slightly in healthcare and consumer staples. Okay. Now, in regards to the other tabs here, as mentioned, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do think it's worth looking at portfolio simplification. Now, whilst we were able to create that 5 composite benchmark, okay, that was just because we wanted to see, basically map out Vanguard's policy construction and making, is what I would say. But for an actual 60/40 portfolio, we can obviously simplify that with one an ETF for the 60% equity element and one 40% ETF, so UK gilts, for the fixed income element. And as we can see, we've simplified that. We've done this at 2 holdings, and we've also slightly outperformed the Vanguard LifeStrategy 6% equity fund as well. So just to be noted. But to summarise, overall, we can see that Vanguard are clearly working within the constraints of their fact sheet, as we initially saw, and you can see that clearly as displayed here. And they're doing this at quite a reasonable fee, 0.22%, versus our 0.17%. Though I will note, I do not think 17 holdings are needed. So that brings me to the end of this portfolio review video. I do hope you found that interesting. And if you do want more of these types of videos, do please let me know in the comments. But other than that, please like and subscribe. And as always, I shall see you in the next one. Okay, thanks all.